Get back to work, Marcus Bell screamed, grabbing Caleb's shoulder while Frank Dawson lay dying on the concrete. You're not a doctor, you're a nobody. But Caleb shook him off. His hands were already bleeding from the pavement. His arms were already burning. And somewhere inside him, something had cracked open that could never be closed again. He looked up at Marcus with eyes that had stopped being afraid. Then fire me, he said, but I'm not stopping. If this is your first time here, welcome. And if you've been with us before, you already know we don't do ordinary stories on this channel. We do the ones that stay with you, the ones that make you call someone you love. So before we go any further, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications so you never miss a story, and drop a comment right now telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Phoenix, Arizona, where a homeless 20-year-old was about to make the most expensive decision of his life. The morning Caleb Whitmore almost let a man die began like every other morning with survival math. I woke at 5:47 a.m. in a motel room that smelled like mildew and old cigarettes, did the same calculation he'd been doing for 11 months, and came up with the same number he always did: not enough. Not enough saved, not enough time, not enough anything. The room cost him $38 a night, and after taxes and the $12 he put away each week toward the apartment deposit, he was slowly, painfully building toward. He had exactly $4.17 left over each day for food. That was his life. That was the entire architecture of his existence, built on numbers that barely held together, on a job that could disappear the moment Marcus Bell decided it should. He splashed cold water on his face, looked at himself in the cracked motel mirror for exactly 3 seconds, then stopped. He'd learned early that looking too long didn't help anything. By 6:15, he was walking the 1.5 miles to Desert Line Garage because the bus cost $2.50, and that was money he didn't have. Phoenix in June didn't care. The heat was already building even before 7 a.m., pressing down on the pavement, baking the air until it tasted like hot metal. Caleb pulled his cap lower, kept his head down, and walked. He'd been walking like that for years. Head down, quiet, invisible. That was how you survived when you had nothing and nobody. Desert Line Garage sat on the eastern edge of a commercial strip where auto parts stores and fast food joints slowly gave way to warehouses and vacant lots. It was not a beautiful place. The parking lot was cracked asphalt with oil stains older than Caleb himself. Overhead lights inside flickered on a bad ballast that Marcus refused to replace, and the shop smelled permanently of grease, rubber, and something chemical that Caleb had never been able to identify. But it was his place. In a life that had no anchors, this garage was the closest thing to solid ground he'd found. He pushed through the side door at 6:58 and went straight to the equipment locker. "You're late," he turned. Marcus Bell was already there, standing near the front bay, with his arms crossed and his mouth doing the particular thing it did when he was building towards something unpleasant. Marcus was 51, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had probably been good-looking once and had since soured into something harder. He wore his authority like a physical weight he carried everywhere, pressing it down on everyone around him just to remind them it was there. "I'm not late," Caleb said, keeping his voice flat. "My shift starts at 7. It's 7. I needed the front bay open by 6:30. You didn't tell me that." "I shouldn't have to tell you that. You should know." Caleb said nothing. This was also part of the math, knowing when to speak and when to absorb. Marcus had been doing this since Caleb's first week. Finding small angles to establish fault, creating a permanent low-level pressure that reminded Caleb of his position. Below, beneath, beholden. Get the front bay open, sweep the lot, and then I need you on the parts inventory. Danny called in sick again. Okay. And Caleb. Marcus waited until Caleb had turned away before he said it, because that was how Marcus worked, always from behind and always catching you mid-movement. "Last month you left a torque wrench in the wrong cabinet." Caleb stopped. "That wrench sat in the wrong cabinet for 2 days before I found it. You understand what that says about your attention to detail?" The honest answer was that he'd moved the wrench because he'd been using the secondary cabinet during a rush and had put it back in the first available space, and that Marcus had probably walked past it 6 times and never noticed until he decided to use it as a point. But Caleb didn't say that. "Won't happen again," he said. Marcus watched him for another moment, then walked away. Caleb opened the front bay. The morning passed the way mornings at Desert Line Garage always did, in motion, in noise, in the particular rhythm of work that Caleb had come to understand without needing to think about it. He could assess a motorcycle's chain tension by sound now. He could tell from the way a customer walked toward the counter, whether they knew what was wrong with their bike or just knew something was wrong. He'd learned to read the machines and the people both, and it was the only place in his life where he felt genuinely competent. At 9:40, a regular named Tommy came in with a Yamaha that was making a noise in the lower end. Sounds like it's chewing itself, Tommy said, leaning against the counter. Probably the primary chain, Caleb said. Could be the tensioner. Let me get it on the stand. Tommy watched him work, which not everyone did. Most customers handed over their keys and retreated to the waiting area. Tommy was different. He was a talker, the kind of man who treated everyone he encountered as a potential friend, and he'd been coming in long enough that he'd started to treat Caleb like one. "How you holding up?" Tommy asked with the weight of someone who actually wanted to know. Caleb kept his eyes on the engine. "Fine. You saving up like you were saying?" "Slowly. Marcus treating you all right, a beat. Then he treats me like he treats everybody." Tommy made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Man, that's a diplomatic answer." "I just keep my head down," Caleb said. "Yeah." Tommy was quiet for a moment. "You're too good for this place. You know that kid with your skills. You should be at one of the bigger shops. Or training. There are programs." "I know," Caleb said, "but it's steady. Steady's what I need right now." What he didn't say that every previous job had collapsed under him. Not because of his work, but because of everything surrounding the work. The background checks that came back with gaps. The addresses that were shelters instead of apartments. The way employers looked at him differently once they understood his situation. Marcus hadn't asked questions. Marcus had looked at Caleb, seen someone desperate, and understood immediately that desperate was useful. So he'd hired him, and Caleb had been grateful for it, and that gratitude had quietly calcified into a leash. But the leash was attached to a room, to food, to survival, and Caleb was not in a position to bite. Tommy's bike turned out to be the tensioner, plus a worn sprocket that had been running rough long enough to start affecting the primary. Caleb laid it out clearly, gave Tommy a fair estimate before Marcus could see the ticket and add his markup, and watched Tommy nod and agree without flinching. "You tell me straight," Tommy said afterward, clapping Caleb on the shoulder. "I appreciate that." That afternoon, Marcus reviewed the ticket. "You underquoted the labor," he said, holding the paper like a piece of evidence. "The sprocket job only took 40 minutes. I quoted 40 minutes. I charge an hour minimum on any sprocket work. You should know that. There's no posted rate card that says that." Marcus looked up from the paper then, and something in his expression shifted, not into anger exactly, but into the particular satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for the moment they can press down harder. "You want to see the rate card, Caleb. You want to start keeping tabs, because I can do that too. I can start keeping very detailed tabs." Caleb looked at him steadily. "I just want to do the work correctly. Then quote the jobs correctly." Marcus set the paper down. "Or I'll find someone who will." He walked away. Caleb stood at the counter and breathed slowly through his nose and thought about the apartment. The imaginary apartment, 1,200 square feet of it, in a building on the north side, he'd already driven past twice on the bus just to look at. The deposit was $800. He had $420 throughout. It was getting closer. It was always getting closer. He just had to hold on. That thought, hold on, was still in his head at 2:30 in the afternoon when the motorcycle appeared in the parking lot. He heard it before he saw it. The engine sound was unmistakable, deep and rhythmic, and carrying a kind of weight that smaller bikes didn't have. He stepped out from the side bay to look, and that's when he saw the man for the first time. Frank Dawson. And it was big, the kind of big that came from decades of physical work, from a body that had never stopped moving, and he wore his age the way certain men did not, as a diminishment, but as an accumulation. He was probably 58 and 59. His leather vest was worn soft along the collar, and the cuffs and the patches on it were not decorative. The Hells Angels patch across the back was the kind that meant something, that had a history attached to it, that had been earned in ways Caleb couldn't fully understand, but instinctively respected. Frank parked, pulled off his gloves, and walked toward the counter with the steady, unhurried movement of a man who'd never felt the need to rush for anyone. "Front brake line," he said when he got close. Started feeling soft yesterday. Don't like soft. Caleb nodded. I'll check the fluid first, then the line itself. Might just be air. Might be, Frank said. He didn't sit in the waiting area. He stood to the side of the bay, watching the way Tommy did not hovering, just present. There was something settled about him, something that made Caleb think of a tree that had survived decades of wind by simply deciding it wouldn't fall. They didn't talk much. Frank asked one or two questions about the brake system, smart questions, the kind that came from someone who knew motorcycles and was checking whether Caleb did too. Caleb answered straight, and Frank listened, and it was the kind of brief, uncomplicated exchange that Caleb was best at: clean information, no performance, no pretending. He was checking the line fitting when he heard the sharp intake of breath. He looked up. Frank's hand was at his chest. Caleb went still. Frank's face had changed. The settled, solid expression had been replaced by something concentrated and wrong. The look of a man trying hard to manage something his body was no longer willing to negotiate. His other hand moved toward the wall of the bay, found nothing to grip, and then Frank Dawson, all 220 pounds of him, went down. Not slowly, not dramatically. He simply went down the way a structure goes when its support fails without warning, and the sound of it hit the concrete floor and rang through the garage like something final. Caleb was moving before the sound finished. He didn't decide to move. His body just went across the bay floor, dropping to his knees beside Frank. His hands already going to the man's throat to check for a pulse that was there but wrong, too slow and too light. And then Frank's chest went still entirely, and Caleb's brain supplied the word that his body had already been acting on CPR. He'd learned it 4 years ago, a free community safety class at a shelter on Jefferson Street, 2 hours on a Saturday morning. A cheerful instructor named Rosa, a rubber dummy named Carl, and a room full of people who weren't there by choice, but were there by necessity. Caleb had paid attention because he paid attention to everything that was free and useful. He'd received a laminated card at the end with the steps on it and carried it in his wallet for 2 years before it disintegrated. He had not thought about that class in 3 years. His hands remembered every second of it. He locked his fingers together, placed them on the center of Frank's chest, and started. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. The rhythm was not difficult to find. What was difficult was the resistance a living body pushes back, even an unconscious one. And doing it correctly meant pushing hard enough to be effective. Hard enough that it hurt his hands and burned up his shoulders and made his lower back start to ache within the first 90 seconds. He heard voices behind him. Someone saying, "Call 911." Someone else saying, "Is he okay?" A woman asking what happened. He tuned all of it into background because the foreground was the only thing that mattered right now. 30 compressions. Frank's chest rose and fell. Then Marcus Bell's voice cutting through everything else. "What the hell are you doing? Get up." Caleb didn't stop. "Call 911. I'm not calling anything. You get up and get back to work. We have 3 bikes waiting." "Call 911, Marcus. This is not your problem. Let someone else handle it." "Darren, call 911. "Caleb, get up." "I'm not getting up." There was a pause, and then Caleb heard the shift in Marcus's footsteps, coming closer, purposeful, and felt the hand on his shoulder. Hard, gripping, pulling. Caleb turned his head just enough to speak clearly. "If you pull me off this man and he dies, you will have a problem that's much bigger than a brake job backlog. Take your hand off my shoulder and call the ambulance." Another pause. The hand came off his shoulder. He heard Marcus say in a voice that was flat and cold and promised nothing good, "You and I are going to have a very direct conversation when this is done." "Fine," Caleb said and went back to the count. I was on his 4th cycle when the reality of what Marcus had just implied fully assembled itself in his mind, and he understood with total clarity exactly what was coming. Not maybe, not possibly, definitely. He would lose this job. Marcus had never needed a justification before. He manufactured them when he wanted them. This was not a manufactured justification. This was a real one, visible to everyone in the garage, documented in his own refusal to stop when ordered. I was going to lose this job. He was going to lose his room. He was going to lose 423 and an imaginary apartment on the north side and every forward inch of ground he'd fought to gain in the last 11 months. He was going to go back to the streets. He knew all of this as clearly as he knew his own name, and he did not stop. He kept pressing Frank Dawson's chest in rhythm, and he counted, and he breathed, and he did not stop, because the alternative of stopping, standing up, walking away, watching Frank Dawson die on the concrete floor of a garage to preserve a job held over him by a man who despised him, was something his body simply refused to do. Some things, once you understand them completely, cannot be undone. Some thresholds, once you cross them, don't let you come back. He had crossed one without knowing it was there. The paramedics arrived at 2:51 p.m. They took over in the efficient, coordinated way of people who did this daily, and Caleb sat back on his heels and let them. His hands shaking now that they'd stopped having to do something, his shoulders screaming, his knees aching from the concrete. One of the paramedics looked at him briefly. "You were doing CPR?" "Yes." "How long?" Caleb thought. "Maybe 12 minutes. Could be more." The paramedic nodded just once, a tight, professional nod, and turned back to Frank. Marcus was waiting. He stood by the office door with his arms crossed and an expression that had gone past anger into something colder. Caleb had seen that expression before on other people in other situations, and he knew what it meant. The decision had already been made. This conversation was a formality. "You disobeyed a direct instruction," Marcus said. Caleb looked at him. "I've been patient with you. I gave you an opportunity when you had nothing, and you repay me by making a scene in my shop, scaring away customers, and refusing to work when I tell you to work." "A man was dying," Caleb said. "That is not your concern. That is what emergency services are for. Your concern is this garage. Your concern is the bikes in those bays. You work for me, Caleb, which means when I say get up, you get up." The waiting area behind Marcus had 3 people in it who were pretending very hard to be fascinated by their phones on the floor. Outside, the ambulance lights were still turning. Caleb could see them through the glass. "Are you firing me?" he said, not a question. "I am terminating your employment, yes." "In the room." Marcus's expression didn't change. "The arrangement for the room was contingent on your employment. Since your employment is ending, how long do I have?" "I'll need you out by Friday." It was Tuesday. Caleb looked at Marcus for a long moment. He thought about 11 months. He thought about 423. He thought about the weight of Frank Dawson's chest under his hands, the specific resistance of it, the way the man's color had started to shift in the last few minutes before the paramedics arrived, going from gray back towards something closer to living. "Okay," he said. He went and collected his jacket from the locker. He came back out, walked through the garage, past the bikes in the bays, and the employees who were suddenly very busy with tasks that didn't require eye contact, and pushed through the front door. Outside, the ambulance was pulling away. Caleb stood in the parking lot and watched it go, and his mind was already running the survival math again, already calculating what 423 could buy him, how many nights in the motel, that was how long before he'd have to start looking for a shelter bed. He did it automatically the way you breathed, not because you wanted to, but because stopping meant something he didn't want to think about. He was 20 years old. He had just saved a man's life and lost everything he owned in the same afternoon. The heat pressed down on him like a physical thing. He picked up his backpack from where he'd left it against the wall, settled it on his shoulders, and started walking. He did not know that in a hospital 6 miles away, a man named Frank Dawson was alive because of him. He did not know that if Frank would wake up in 3 hours and ask before he asked for water, before he asked for his wife, before he asked for anything else. A single question: who saved me? He did not know any of that. He just walked, head down, quiet, invisible, the way he'd always survived. But something had changed. Something inside the architecture of who Caleb Whitmore was had shifted irrevocably and without ceremony in the 12 minutes he'd spent on his knees on a concrete floor doing something nobody had asked him to do. He didn't have a word for it yet. He just knew that when Marcus Bell had grabbed his shoulder and told him to get up, the fear, the constant, ambient, ever-present fear that had governed every decision he'd made for years, had simply not come. He'd been afraid for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to not be afraid. He still didn't have a job. He still didn't have a home. He still had $423 and nowhere to go. But somewhere in the walk back through the Phoenix heat, with the backpack rubbing his shoulders raw and the sun turning everything white and merciless, Caleb Whitmore understood something small and enormous at the same time. He had looked Marcus Bell in the eye with the man's hand on his shoulder, and he had not flinched. That had never happened before. He didn't know yet what it meant. But it was the first thing in a very long time that felt like it actually belonged to him. He made it 4 blocks before his legs stopped working properly. Not from exhaustion, not from the heat, from something else, something that moved through him all at once, like a current switching off. And he found himself sitting on the curb outside a boarded-up laundromat with his backpack between his knees and his hands hanging loose in front of him, staring at the cracked asphalt because looking at anything else required more effort than he currently had. 4 blocks from Desert Line Garage. That was how far 11 months of surviving got you when it ended. He sat there for a long time, long enough that the shadows shifted and the traffic thinned and a man walking a dog crossed the street to avoid him, which he noticed and filed away without feeling anything particular about it. Being avoided was not new. Being read as a problem by strangers was not new. What was new, what kept surfacing, no matter how many times he pushed it back under, was the silence where the fear used to be. He kept waiting for the panic to arrive, the sharp-edged, chest-tightening panic he'd learned to manage so well over the years. The one that told him he was running out of time, running out of options, running out of road. It had been his constant companion since he was 16, and the last foster placement fell apart, and the system released him into a world that had not been waiting for him, but the panic wasn't coming. In its place was something flatter and stranger, something that felt almost like calm, which made no sense because calm was a luxury and he was sitting on a curb with $423 to his name and 3 days until he had to be out of a room he couldn't afford to stay in anyway. He pulled out his phone, cracked screen, 23% battery, and opened the Notes app. He did the math again, not because he needed to, but because doing the math gave his hands something to do. Motel room, $38 a night. He had enough for 11 nights. After that, shelters. He knew the system. He'd navigated it before. Jefferson Street had beds available if you got there before 4. The church on Camelback did sandwiches on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The library on Central let you sit for as long as you were quiet and not visibly sleeping. Hy knew all of it. He had hoped powerfully and privately and without ever saying it out loud to anyone that he was done knowing it. He closed the Notes app. He sat on the curb until the battery dropped to 18%. Then he stood up, settled the backpack, and started toward the motel. He did not let himself think about Frank Dawson. He did not let himself calculate what those 12 minutes had cost him in concrete terms, the apartment deposit timeline, the months of work, the particular fragile structure he'd been building so carefully. He had a rule about that kind of thinking. You didn't add up losses when you were still in the middle of them, because that arithmetic only ever produced one answer, and that answer didn't help you move. So he moved. The motel was called the Sunridge Inn, which was neither sunny nor on a ridge, but it had a door that locked from the inside and a bathroom with hot water. Most mornings, and for the last 11 months, it had been home, in the only way that word had ever applied to Caleb's life, functionally, provisionally, without sentimentality. He went to his room, sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time since Frank Dawson hit the floor, he let himself feel the full weight of his hands. They were sore in a specific way, deep in the muscles of the palms across the heel of each hand where the pressure had concentrated. He flexed his fingers and felt the ache move up through his wrists. He had pushed hard. The paramedic had told him later in that brief professional exchange in the parking lot that he'd been doing it correctly, the right depth, the right rate. He hadn't known he remembered it that well. Your body remembered things your mind had let go of. He lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and thought, I don't regret it. That surprised him. He thought about Marcus's face when he'd said, take your hand off my shoulder. He thought about the moment the fear hadn't come. He thought about 3 days until Friday and 423 and 11 nights in this room and then whatever came after. He ran all of it through his mind clearly and deliberately, and at the end of it, he still didn't regret it. That was new. That was something he didn't have a category for yet. He closed his eyes. He slept for the first time in weeks without his jaw clenched. He didn't know that across the city at St. Joseph's Hospital, a man was waking up. Frank Dawson came back to consciousness at 6:14 p.m. The way some men came back from certain experiences, not gradually, not softly, but all at once like a switch. One moment there was nothing, and then there was the white ceiling of a hospital room and the smell of antiseptic and the sound of a monitor that had been tracking his heart with quiet electronic patience. His wife, Carol, was in the chair beside the bed. She had her hand over her mouth and her eyes were wet, and when she saw his eyes open, she made a sound that was not quite a word and grabbed his hand with both of hers. Frank. Hey, his voice was sandpaper. Hey, I'm here. She couldn't speak for a moment. She just held his hand and pressed it against her face and breathed. Frank let her. He knew what it meant to be on the other side of a room like this. He'd been on the other side twice before with other people, and he knew that the person in the bed had to hold still and let the person in the chair come back to themselves. When she could talk, she told him what the doctors had said. Cardiac arrest, sudden and severe. If he hadn't received CPR within the first few minutes, the outcome would have been very different. They used that phrase very different in the careful way of people who meant something specific by it and were choosing not to say it directly. Frank listened. Then, "Who was it?" Carol frowned. "What? Who did the CPR? Who was it?" She looked confused. They didn't tell me. One of the employees at the garage, I think. Why, I want to know who it was." "Frank, Carol." His voice was quiet, but it had the particular quality that she'd learned over 31 years, meant the subject was not negotiable. "I want to know who kept me alive." She looked at him for a moment, then nodded and went to find a nurse. The nurse didn't know the details, but suggested calling the garage, and Carol did, and the person who answered, not Marcus. Someone else, one of the younger mechanics, told her what she relayed back to Frank 20 minutes later. It was a kid named Caleb, young guy, maybe 20, he did maintenance. He was the one who, and here the mechanic's voice had shifted, had taken on a quality Carol couldn't fully interpret. He was the one who got fired for not stopping when Marcus told him to. Frank lay very still for a moment after Carol finished. "Say that again." She did. He lay still again. Then something moved across his face, not a recognizable emotion exactly, but something deep and tectonic, the kind of internal shift that happens when information you have just received rearranges everything it touches on the way in. "He got fired," Frank said. "That's what they said." "For saving my life." Carol didn't answer because it wasn't a question. Frank closed his eyes. He stayed that way long enough that Carol thought he might have fallen back asleep, and she was reaching for the call button when he spoke again. "Get me Danny Reeves's number." "Frank, you need to rest." "Danny's the chapter president. His number's in my phone in the jacket pocket. Get it for me." "You just had cardiac arrest." "Carol," again that voice. "Please." She got him the number. The call lasted 4 minutes. Frank said very little. He described the situation in flat sequential terms: the garage, the kid, the CPR, what happened after. He let the facts do the work because Danny Reeves was a man who understood facts and didn't need anything dressed up. When Frank finished, Danny was quiet for a moment. Then kid's name, Caleb Whitmore, 20 years old, works at Desert Line Garage. Or worked. Frank paused. "Find out where he is." The call ended. Frank handed the phone back to Carol, leaned back against his pillow, and breathed. "You need to sleep," Carol said. "I know." "Frank." "I know." He looked at her. He was 20 years old, Carol. He had nothing. The guy who owns that shop, he held it over the kid's head, his room, everything. And the kid still didn't stop. Carol was quiet. "He could have stood up," Frank said. "He could have stood up the second Marcus started yelling, and nobody would have blamed him. Nobody. He had every reason to." He stopped. "But he didn't." Carol looked at her husband's face and recognized the expression on. It had seen it on him across 31 years in specific moments. Rare moments when something had reached through all the layers of him and touched something that didn't have a hard shell around it. She reached over and took his hand again. "Sleep," she said gently. He did, but not before he said, very quietly, one more thing. "Nobody gets left like that." Caleb woke the next morning at 5:47, the same as always, and lay staring at the ceiling for exactly 45 seconds before the sequence of yesterday's events reassembled itself in his mind. He let it happen without trying to manage it. Then he got up, splashed water on his face, looked at himself in the mirror for longer than 3 seconds this time, and said out loud to no one, 2 days. 2 days until Friday. He needed to figure out his next move. I made a list in his head while he drank the last of a box of instant oatmeal. He'd been rationing shelters first because the motel money wouldn't last and he needed to preserve it. Check in at Jefferson Street today, get on the list for a bed. Then job applications, he'd need references, which was complicated, but Tommy had offered his number twice and meant it, and there was a guy named Hector at the auto parts store on Van Buren who told Caleb once he was wasted at Marcus's place. Hector was worth a call. The plan was thin. But thin was better than nothing, and Caleb had worked with nothing before. He was lacing up his boots when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers were rarely good news when you had no money. They were collection agencies or survey robots, or occasionally a shelter calling back about a bed. And he didn't have outstanding collections, and he wasn't expecting a shelter call yet. But something made him pick up. Caleb Whitmore, male voice, deep, unhurried, the voice of someone who had never needed to rush. Yeah, Caleb said. Who's this? My name's Danny Reeves. I'm looking for the young man who worked at Desert Line Garage yesterday afternoon. Something tightened in Caleb's chest. Is this about am I in some kind of trouble? A beat. Then not unkindly, no son, you are not in any kind of trouble. Caleb said nothing. I'm calling because a friend of mine wants to know how you're doing, Danny said. Frank Dawson, you know that name? The tightening in Caleb's chest moved, changed shape, became something he couldn't immediately identify. Is he okay? He's alive, Danny said. He's going to be fine because of you. Caleb sat down on the edge of the bed. His legs had done the same thing they'd done on the curb yesterday. Not weakness exactly, just a sudden decision to not be standing. I'm glad, he said, and meant it simply without calculation. Frank wanted me to reach out. Danny continued. He heard what happened after, with Marcus and the job. He wanted me to ask, where are you right now? Are you okay? Caleb looked around the motel room, the peeling wallpaper, the window that fogged on one side, the $423 in his phone's notes app. I'm managing, he said. That's not an answer to where you are. Sunridge Inn, on. I know where it is. Danny paused. Can I send someone to meet with you today just to talk? Every self-preservation instinct Caleb had developed over 20 years said, be careful. Said you don't know these people. Said nothing comes free. Said when something seems like help, it usually means someone wants something. He heard all of those voices clearly. And then he thought about Frank Dawson going down on the concrete floor and the paramedic's tight professional nod and the moment the fear hadn't come. Sure, he said. Okay. The man Danny sent was named Ray. He arrived at 10:30, knocked on Caleb's door with 3 unhurried knocks, and when Caleb opened it, he found a man roughly Frank Dawson's age, maybe a little younger, maybe 55, with the same leather vest and the same quality of presence that communicated without aggression. That here was a person who knew exactly who he was and had no particular anxiety about it. Ray Castillo, the man said, extending a hand. You're Caleb. Yeah. Mind if I come in for a minute? Caleb stepped back. Ray came in, looked around the room without commenting on it, and sat in the single chair by the desk. Caleb sat on the bed. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who were both measuring the situation and not trying to hide that they were doing it. Frank's asking after you, Ray said finally. I heard. I'm glad he's okay. You know what you did for him? Caleb said nothing. The doctor told his wife, Ray said. Wish. A few more minutes, maybe 3, maybe 4, and it wouldn't have mattered. His heart was in full arrest. He needed someone to keep the blood moving until the paramedics could do the rest. Ray leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. That was you. I knew how, from a class I took. Lots of people have taken a CPR class, Ray said. Most of them in that situation with a boss screaming in their ear, with everything they needed to survive on the line. Most of them don't stay on the floor. He paused. You know that, right? Caleb looked at his hands. They were still sore. I couldn't stand up, he said. I tried to think about it, and I just couldn't. Why? I thought for a moment before answering because the question deserved a real answer, and Ray didn't seem like someone who wanted a performance. Because he was right there, Caleb said. He was right there in front of me, and he was dying, and there was something I could do. And I know what it's like to be somewhere and have people look right at you and walk away. He stopped. I couldn't do that to somebody. Ray was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, Marcus Bell fired you. Yes? Told you to clear out of your room by Friday. Yes. How long you been at this motel? 11 months. And before this motel, a beat. Various places. Ray nodded slowly as if he'd expected that answer or something like it. Caleb, I'm going to ask you a direct question and I want a direct answer. Are you in a safe situation right now? I'm managing. That's not what I asked. Caleb looked at him. The man's eyes were steady and patient, and there was nothing in them that looked like pity, which was the thing that always made Caleb's jaw tighten, that particular expression of people who had more looking at people who had less. There was none of that in Ray. There was just the question. No, Caleb said. Not really. I have 11 nights here and then I need to figure something out. Ray nodded. Okay. He reached into the chest pocket of his vest and pulled out a card, held it out. Frank is getting released from the hospital tomorrow. He wants to meet you. Not a big thing, just a conversation. Coffee wherever you're comfortable. Can you do that? Caleb took the card. Why does he want to meet me? Because you saved his life and he doesn't take that lightly, Ray said simply. And because he heard what it cost you and he doesn't take that lightly either. Caleb looked at the card. A phone number, that was all. Okay, he said. Okay, Ray said and stood. He moved toward the door, then stopped. Without turning, he said, for what it's worth, what you did in that garage, most grown men wouldn't have. Most people with 10 times what you have wouldn't have. He paused. I've been riding for 30 years, and I've known men who talk a great deal about loyalty and standing up for people. You actually did it. He left. Caleb sat in the silent motel room holding the card and felt something in him that was difficult to name. Not relief, exactly, not hope exactly. Something more provisional than hope. Something that said maybe. Maybe the math isn't only one kind. He didn't sleep that night. Not from anxiety, not from fear. Both of those were familiar companions, and he knew their shapes. He didn't sleep because he kept coming back to what Ray had said. Most people wouldn't have stayed on the floor. He had never thought about it that way. He'd been too busy managing the consequences to stop and think about the act itself as something separate, something that had its own value independent of what it had cost him. The idea was uncomfortable and a little foreign, like trying to use a muscle he hadn't used before. He lay in the dark and turned it over. By morning, he'd arrived at something simple. He had stayed on the floor because he couldn't leave. And he couldn't leave because something in him had decided in the fraction of a second before conscious thought engaged that Frank Dawson's life was worth more than his own security. I didn't know when he'd become the kind of person who made that calculation. He wasn't sure he'd known he was. He met Frank at a diner on the south side, Frank's suggestion, through Ray's text, a specific booth near the back 11 in the morning on a Thursday. Caleb arrived 10 minutes early and sat facing the door because that was another habit from years of navigating situations where knowing who was coming toward you mattered. Frank came through the door at exactly 11. He moved carefully, not slowly exactly, but with the deliberate economy of a man whose body was still communicating the events of 2 days ago. He had color in his face. He was not the gray man on the concrete floor. He saw Caleb immediately and crossed the room without hesitation and slid into the booth across from him. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Frank was bigger up close than he'd seemed on the floor, which was a strange thing to realize that Caleb's only prior image of this man was horizontal, diminished, unreachable. Seeing him vertical and present and looking back at him with the same kind of direct attention that Ray had used felt like an adjustment. You're smaller than I pictured, Frank said. You're bigger than I remember, Caleb said. Frank's mouth moved something between a smile and something else. Fair. He picked up the menu, then set it back down. Coffee? Sure. They ordered. The server came and went. Outside, the city moved around them in its normal morning rhythm, indifferent and continuous. I have 2 things to say to you, Frank said. Then I want to hear about you. The 2 things first. He held Caleb's gaze. First, thank you. I know that sounds small for what it is, but I'm not good with words that are bigger than what I mean, so thank you. You put your hands on a stranger's chest, and you kept his heart going, and you didn't stop when they told you to stop. And that stranger is sitting here across from you right now instead of in a box somewhere. That's because of you. Caleb looked at his coffee cup. Look at me, Frank said quietly. He looked up. That's because of you, Frank said again. I need you to hear it and not look away from it. It was one of the hardest things Caleb had done in recent memory. Not physically hard, just the particular difficulty of receiving something without finding a way to minimize it or redirect it or file it somewhere it wouldn't take up space. Okay, he said. Good. Frank leaned back. Second thing I heard about Marcus, about the chum, the room, all of it. And I want to be clear about something. His voice didn't rise. It had the quality of something that didn't need volume to have weight. That is not how this ends. That is not the last chapter of what happened in that garage. Caleb frowned. What do you mean? I mean, you don't lose everything for saving my life, and then the story's over and you're on the street. That doesn't happen. That you don't need to. I know I don't need to, Frank said. I'm choosing to. There's a difference and it matters. He paused. My chapter has resources, people, contacts in this city who owe us more than I'll ever call in all at once. I'm not telling you I'm going to fix your life. I'm telling you I'm not going to let what happened go unanswered. Caleb sat very still. Why, he said, not challenging, genuinely asking. I was nobody to you. I'm still nobody. I swept floors at a garage. Frank looked at him for a long moment. No, he said, you're not nobody. You were nobody to Marcus because Marcus needed you to be. But the thing you did in that garage, that's not a nobody thing. That's a very specific kind of person thing. He picked up his coffee. I've been riding with my brothers for 30 years. I've known men who would have done what you did. Not many, but I've known them, and every one of them thought they were ordinary too. Caleb didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. Frank talked and Caleb listened, and the coffee got refilled twice, and somewhere in the middle of the second cup, Frank asked him to talk about himself, about how he'd gotten to Phoenix, about the years before the garage, and Caleb talked slowly at first, and then less slowly in the flat, honest way he spoke, when he wasn't calculating the impact of what he was saying. He told Frank about the foster system, about aging out at 18 with a trash bag of clothes and a bus pass and a social worker's handshake, about the months when sleeping in the park is better than sleeping in certain shelters, about the jobs that had fallen apart one way or another, and the way desperation made you accept terms you knew were wrong, because wrong terms were better than no terms at all, about Desert Line Garage and Marcus Bell and 423 and an imaginary apartment he'd been saving towards for 11 months. Frank listened to all of it without interrupting, without the expressions people sometimes made, the ones that were supposed to communicate empathy, but actually communicated relief that they were on the listening side of the story and not the telling side. He just listened. When Caleb finished, Frank was quiet for a moment. Then what do you actually know how to do besides CPR? Something about the question, so direct, so free of preamble, made Caleb almost laugh. Motorcycles mostly, maintenance diagnostics, some engine work. I'm good with electrical. Marcus never let me do the bigger jobs, but I know more than he used. You have your license. Clean license. I borrowed a bike once, but I've never had one of my own. Any interest in a real apprenticeship, formal training, not Marcus Bell's version? Caleb looked at him. What are you saying? I'm saying we have a brother who runs one of the best motorcycle shops in Phoenix, Frank said. Actual shop, actual training, actual pay. He's been looking for somebody for 8 months. The last 3 guys he tried were wrong, 2 of them couldn't show up on time, and 1 of them didn't know the difference between a diagnostic and a guess. He paused. You'd have to start from the bottom. But it's real work, real money, real opportunity, not Marcus Bell holding a room over your head. Caleb stared at him. There's an apartment too, Frank continued before Caleb could speak. Nothing fancy. Small place, 1 bedroom, north side. Friend of mine owns the building. First month's free. After that, standard rent market rate, nothing owed to anyone. You earn it, it's yours, no strings. The silence stretched. Caleb stopped, started again. I don't understand why you're doing this. Frank set down his cup and looked at him steadily. Because you got on your knees on a concrete floor for a stranger when nobody else moved. Because a man told you that everything you had depended on standing up and you didn't stand up. Because you are 20 years old and you have been surviving alone since you were 16 and you did something that most people with every advantage in the world wouldn't have done. His jaw tightened slightly, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more deliberate. And because I was a 22-year-old kid with nothing once a long time ago and somebody did something for me that I never fully paid back. This is as close as I'm going to get. Caleb looked down at the table. He was aware with a clarity that was almost physical that this was one of those moments. The kind that divided a life into before and after. The kind that didn't announce themselves as they happened, but that you recognized feeling it in your chest like something settling into place. He'd had a handful of those moments. None of them had felt like this. None of them had felt like someone handing him a door. I'd need to see the shop, he said. Meet the owner. Of course. And I'd need to be clear about expectations. I'm not interested in owing somebody the same way I owed Marcus. You won't, Frank said. My brother's name is Joe Tran. He's fair. He doesn't do what Marcus does. If you have a problem with how he runs things, you tell him directly, and he'll tell you directly back. That's how it works. In the apartment, this is rent, not charity. First month's on me. After that, your money, your place. Deal. Caleb looked up. Frank was watching him with the patient, settled expression of a man who had already decided how this conversation ended and was simply waiting for the other person to arrive at the same place. Deal, Caleb said. It was quiet for a moment. Then Frank said, one more thing. Caleb waited. Danny Reeves, you spoke with him on the phone. He wants to put something together. Not big, just a chapter. Some of the guys want to meet you, if you're okay with that. Why? Frank's expression shifted slightly. The particular shift of someone who's about to tell you something true about yourself that you haven't figured out yet. Because they heard the story and they want to look the kid in the eye who stayed on the floor. He paused. Some things in this world you just have to show up and acknowledge. Some things deserve that. Caleb thought about being invisible, about walking with his head down, about being the person in the room that people looked past because looking at him required acknowledging something uncomfortable about the world. Some things deserve that. Okay, he said. He didn't know yet what that gathering would look like. He didn't know that when Friday came, the day Marcus Bell had given him to clear out, he wouldn't be scrambling for a shelter bed. I didn't know that his life was about to change in a way that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with a single 12-minute decision on a concrete floor. He just knew that across the table a man was looking at him like he was somebody. And for the first time in 20 years, Caleb Whitmore let himself be looked at that way. The deal was made on a Thursday morning over 2 cups of coffee and a handshake that Caleb felt in his chest more than his hand. He walked back to the Sunridge Inn with Frank's card in his jacket pocket and Ray's number in his phone and something sitting differently in his body, not lighter exactly, but differently distributed, like weight that had been pressing on one point for so long that the sudden shift of it felt almost disorienting. He sat on the edge of his bed and tried to do the survival math the way he always did, and found that the numbers had changed enough that the calculation no longer resolved into the same single answer. He had 2 days until Friday. He had a potential apartment. He had a potential job. He had $423 that might not need to disappear after all. He sat with that for a while and didn't entirely trust it because trust was a thing you built incrementally and he was not in the habit of building it quickly. Frank seemed real. Ray seemed real. But Caleb had been in situations before where things seemed real and then resolved into something more complicated, and he had learned to keep a quiet partition between what was happening now and what he was allowing himself to believe about what came next. Still, he slept that night without clenching his jaw for the second night in a row. Friday came. He was packed before 7, which did not take long because everything Caleb owned fit into one backpack and one duffel bag he'd found at a Goodwill 3 years ago. He stripped the bed out of habit, left the key on the desk, and walked out without looking back. Not because he was being stoic, he'd gotten good enough at distinguishing between genuine and performed emotion to know the difference in himself, but because there was genuinely nothing in that room worth carrying in his memory. It was a motel room he'd needed and now didn't need anymore, and the transaction was complete. Ray was outside in a truck, just sitting there, engine off, arms resting on the steering wheel like a man who'd been waiting a reasonable amount of time and was fine with waiting more. Caleb stopped on the sidewalk. Frank asked me to drive you, Ray said through the open window. You okay with that? Caleb looked at the truck, at Ray, at the motel behind him. Yeah, he said, okay. He put his bags in the back and got in. They drove north mostly in silence, which Caleb appreciated. Ray had the quality of a man who didn't fill silence because he was nervous. He filled it when he had something to say and didn't when he didn't, and right now he apparently didn't. They passed through neighborhoods Caleb knew, and neighborhoods he didn't, and the city did the thing it always did in the early morning, looking more possible than it did later in the day, before the heat settled in and everything contracted back into its usual difficulty. The apartment building was on a residential street with mature trees planted along the sidewalk that cast actual shade, which in Phoenix in June was not a small thing. The building was 3 stories, maybe 30 units, built in the 70s, but kept up. The manager was a compact, quiet woman named Diane who showed Caleb the unit on the second floor, handed him the key, and told him the building rules in 5 sentences without making it a performance. The apartment was small, one bedroom, a living space, a kitchen with a window that opened. The walls were off-white and slightly scuffed in a few places, and the bathroom fixtures were older but functional. It was the most beautiful thing Caleb had seen in 4 years. He stood in the middle of the empty living room and felt something move through him that he couldn't name quickly and didn't try to. Ray stood in the doorway and watched and didn't say anything. After a minute, Caleb said, "It's real." "It's real," Ray confirmed. "A real address." "Yes." Caleb put his hand flat against the wall. The plaster was cool under his palm. He pressed it there for a moment, not dramatically, not performing anything, just making physical contact with the reality of it. A wall that was his, a door that locked from the inside with a key that belonged to him. "Okay," he said finally. "Joe wants to meet you today," Ray said. "At the shop, whenever you're ready." "I'm ready now." Joe Tran's shop was called Pacific Ironworks, which was a name that sounded bigger than the space itself, a single-bay operation on the east side that Joe had built from nothing over 12 years into something that had a waiting list and a reputation. I was 50 Vietnamese American with the careful hands of a man who'd been doing precision mechanical work since he was 17, in the direct manner of someone who'd learned early that indirection was expensive. I met Caleb at the door and looked him over. Once the way a mechanic looked at a machine, not dismissive, just efficient. "Ray says you know bikes," Joe said. "I know maintenance and diagnostics," Caleb said. "Some engine work, better with electrical than most people my age." "What's your weak area?" No one had ever asked him that in a job interview. He'd had exactly 3 formal job interviews in his life, and all of them had been about proving competence, not mapping its edges. "Transmission rebuilds on older European models," he said because it was true. "I can do it, but I'm slow, and I know I'm slow." Joe nodded once, the tight professional nod of a man who respected accurate self-assessment. "Come in." I put Caleb in front of a 1974 BMW R9US that had been sitting on a stand for 2 weeks. "Tell me what's wrong with it," Joe said, and walked away. Caleb stood in front of the BMW for a moment, then crouched down and started from the beginning. He went through it methodically, not fast, not performing speed working the way he actually worked, which was systematically and quietly talking to himself in a low murmur, the way he developed the habit of doing when he was alone in a bay and thinking through a problem. He checked the obvious things first and eliminated them. Then he moved to the less obvious things. 20 minutes in, he found it a fuel delivery issue that had been compounding a carburetor problem that had been misdiagnosed twice based on the notes Joe had left on the stand, leading to 2 rounds of unnecessary work that hadn't addressed the root cause. He stood up. Joe was already watching from the doorway to the back office. "Carburetor's not the problem," Caleb said. "The fuel petcock is sticking intermittently. It's only delivering correctly under certain throttle conditions. Someone rebuilt the carb twice trying to fix a symptom." Joe came over. He crouched, looked where Caleb was pointing, straightened up. "The last 2 guys I had didn't find that in a week," he said. "They were probably working from the previous diagnosis," Caleb said. "It's easy to do. You fix what you're told is broken instead of starting fresh." Joe looked at him for a long moment. "Monday," he said. 7 a.m. 90-day trial period. Fair wage, not Marcus Bell wages, real ones. You work out, it's permanent. You don't work out, I'll tell you directly, and you'll know why." "Deal." "Deal," Caleb said. He walked out of Pacific Ironworks at 2 in the afternoon with a start date and a key to his own apartment in his pocket, and the strangest feeling he'd had in recent memory. The feeling of someone who has been holding their breath for so long that the first real exhale is almost painful. He called Ray from the sidewalk. "It went well," Ray asked. "Monday," Caleb said. "He offered me the job." A pause, then in a voice that had something warm in it under the matter-of-fact surface, "Good. Frank will be pleased. Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "The gathering Danny mentioned. When is it?" Another pause different from the first. "Saturday evening. Frank wanted to wait until you had the job situation sorted. He didn't want it to feel like pressure, like you owed something before it happened." Caleb thought about that. "Okay," he said. "I'll be there." He spent Friday evening in his apartment on the floor because he had no furniture yet, eating a sandwich he'd bought from a deli 3 blocks away, And for the first time in as long as he could remember, he was not doing survival math. He was just eating a sandwich in a quiet room that belonged to him and listening to the city outside the window and existing in something that felt cautiously and provisionally like peace. He almost didn't let himself feel it. Almost. But then he thought about what Ray had said. Most people with 10 times what you have wouldn't have done it. And he thought about Frank's voice when he said, "That's because of you." And he thought about the wall, cool under his palm that morning, and he let himself feel it. Just a little. Just enough. Saturday came. Ray picked him up at 5:30 and drove him to a property in the desert outside the city, a large flat space that the chapter used for gatherings far enough from neighbors to be its own world for a few hours. Caleb could hear them before he could see them. The sound of motorcycles arriving, engines, cutting voices layering over each other in the gathering dusk. He had been in large groups before. He'd been in shelters with 40 people in a room and soup kitchen, lines with 100 in city parks where crowds moved around him like water around a stone. But he had never been in a group that was gathering specifically because of him, and the knowledge of it sat strangely in his body as Ray's truck pulled in and he saw how many bikes were already there. "How many?" he said quietly. "Close to 90, Ray said. "Maybe more by now. Word got around." Caleb looked out the windshield. "Why so many?" Ray turned off the engine. "Because the story got around," he said simply. "People heard it and they wanted to be here, that's all. Nobody made them come." He got out of the truck. Frank was there, standing with a group of men near the center, still moving carefully, still carrying the caution of someone whose body had recently been through something significant but present and solid in the way he'd been in the diner, the way that communicated, "I am still here, and I intend to remain here." He saw Caleb and crossed toward him, and the men around him shifted to watch without it being a performance. "You made it," Frank said. "I made it." Frank looked at him. "Job." "Monday," Caleb said. Something moved across Frank's face, satisfaction mixed with something deeper, something that had the texture of relief. "Good," he said. "Good." He put a hand on Caleb's shoulder briefly, the kind of contact that meant something without being theatrical about it. "Come on." What happened next was not what Caleb had expected. He'd prepared himself for something ceremonial, something formal, the kind of event where someone stood up and made a speech, and you were the subject of it, and you had to stand there and receive it and try not to disappear inside yourself. He'd spent part of Friday night mentally rehearsing how to manage that. But Danny Reeves, who turned out to be a compact man in his early 60s, with a gray beard and the kind of authority that came from 30 years of actually doing things rather than just claiming to have done them, did not make a speech. He walked up to Caleb, looked at him for a moment and said, "I heard you told Marcus Bell to move and then went back to what you were doing." "Something like that," Caleb said. "How old are you?" 20. Danny nodded slowly in the way you nodded when information confirmed something you had already half believed. "You hungry?" There was food. Real food, the kind that came from people who knew how to cook, served on folding tables that had been set up with the practical efficiency of people who'd done this many times. Caleb ate and talked to men he'd never met and found that talking to them was easier than he'd expected. They were not the population he might have imagined from the outside, not threatening, not performative, not interested in establishing hierarchies with a stranger in the first 5 minutes. They were direct. They were funny in a dry way that required paying attention to catch. They asked him questions about his work, about bikes, about what he knew and how he'd learned it, and they listened to his answers with the focused interest of people who valued competence and recognized it when they heard it. A man named Victor, who was 63 and had arms like bridge cables and a voice like someone had partially removed his volume dial, sat next to Caleb for the better part of an hour and talked to him about carburetor theory and transmission rebuilds on vintage European bikes with the enthusiasm of a man describing his first love. By the end of it, Caleb had learned 3 things he hadn't known before and told Victor about the BMW R90ES at Joe's shop, and Victor leaned back and said, "Petcock. It's always the petcock on those," and laughed at himself. It was the most normal Caleb had felt in the company of people since before he could clearly remember. And then Danny found him again. He came up beside Caleb quietly in the way of someone who had something specific to say and was choosing his moment. The gathering had settled into its later rhythm, quieter, more spread out, the energy of arrival, having given way to something slower and more comfortable. "There's something you should know," Danny said. Caleb waited. Marcus Bell's garage, Danny said. You know he had other employees in situations similar to yours. Caleb thought about it. He'd suspected there were things about the way Marcus operated that didn't work unless you had people who couldn't easily leave. But he'd kept his head down and minded his own math and hadn't asked. I figured, he said. 3 other people, Danny said. Same arrangement, housing tied to employment. All of them in situations where they needed Marcus more than Marcus needed them. One of them's been there 4 years, he paused. After your situation got around, 2 of them reached out to some people we know. They started talking. Caleb went still. There are labor violations, Danny continued. Significant ones. The housing employment arrangement he was running is not legal when it's structured the way Marcus structured it. There are wage issues too. There are records. Some of the workers kept records. He looked at Caleb steadily. The people they reached out to have been in contact with the state labor board. It's moving. Caleb said nothing for a moment. I didn't do anything, he said finally. I didn't file anything. You didn't have to, Danny said. You leaving was what cracked it open. You were the one person and Marcus couldn't keep quiet because you weren't there anymore. When the others saw what happened to you, the whole thing, including what came after it, gave them something. He paused. Courage works like that sometimes. One person does it first, and then other people find out they can too. Caleb looked out at the gathering, the bikes parked in rough rows, the men moving in small clusters, the ordinary Saturday evening texture of people who trusted each other enough to be comfortable. Is Marcus going to be okay, he asked, and then felt the absurdity of the question even as he asked it. Danny looked at him with something that might have been amusement under the surface. He's going to have some difficult conversations with some state officials, he said. Whether he's okay after that depends on what they find. He paused. That's not your problem to manage, Caleb. You didn't do anything wrong. You saved a man's life and got fired for it, and the people who were already being wronged by the same man finally had enough. That sequence of events belongs to all of them. Caleb nodded slowly, but something was moving in him, something uncomfortable and important. The feeling you got when you realized that things you thought were isolated were actually connected, that your single decision had sent ripples into water you hadn't known was there. He had stayed on the floor for Frank Dawson, but in doing so, he had apparently also done something for 3 people he'd never spoken to, never noticed fully, never known were there in the same walls he was in. That was not something he'd planned. That was not something he would have predicted. He filed it somewhere important and didn't try to make it into something larger than it was. Later, toward the end of the evening, Frank found him again. They sat apart from the main group in the comfortable way of 2 people who'd established enough of a language between them to not need activity to fill the space. The desert air had cooled the way it did after dark, and the stars were doing what they did in the desert, showing up in numbers that felt almost argumentative, like the sky was making a case. How are you feeling? Frank asked. Weird, Caleb said honestly. Good weird or bad weird? Caleb thought about it. I don't know yet. Both maybe. Frank nodded like that was the right answer. First time someone does something significant for you, it feels strange, he said. You don't know where to put it. I'm not good at, Caleb started then stopped. Receiving, Frank said. Yeah. Most people who've had to survive alone aren't, Frank said. You get so used to them being all outgo and no income that when something comes in the other direction, your system doesn't know what to do with it. He was quiet for a moment. You're going to have to learn. That's not a criticism, it's just true. The apartment, the job, those aren't charity and they're not debt. They're just what happens when someone sees what you actually did and responds to it. You're going to have to let that be real. Caleb looked at the sky. I keep thinking about whether I deserve it, he said, and hated how it sounded, even as he said it, but said it anyway because Frank had earned honesty. Wrong question, Frank said immediately. Deserving is the wrong frame. The question isn't whether you deserve things to get better. The question is whether you're going to build something real when they do. He paused. Are you, Caleb turned that over. Yes, he said. Good. Frank picked it up his coffee cup, which had gone cold. Then stop asking the first question. Caleb almost smiled. Just like that. Just like that, Frank said without a trace of irony. They sat a while longer. A man named Curtis, who had a laugh like a truck engine and had spent 20 minutes earlier telling Caleb a story about a road trip to New Mexico that had involved a broken chain, A gas station and a very confused pharmacist came over and said something to Frank in a low voice that Caleb didn't catch. Frank's expression shifted. "What?" Caleb said. Frank looked at him. "Marcus Bell called the hospital yesterday," he said, and his voice had taken on the flat, particular quality Caleb recognized from the garage, from the moment Frank had woken up and asked his first question. "Looking for information about what I'd said to people, about the garage." Caleb went still. "He called the hospital," he said slowly. "The nurse's station," Frank said. "Asked if a patient named Frank Dawson had made statements about an employee matter." He paused. "They didn't give him anything. But he called." The implication of it assembled itself in Caleb's mind piece by piece. Marcus had understood faster than Caleb had that the consequences of what happened in that garage were not finished. Marcus was already moving, trying to find out what Frank had said to whom, to what end. He was already doing damage control. "He's scared," Caleb said. "He should be," Frank said simply, "but that's also not your problem to manage." "I know." "Do you?" Caleb looked at him. "He had that power over me for 11 months because I had nowhere else to go," he said. "That's done now. He can make calls, he can look for information. None of it touches me the same way it did." Frank held his gaze for a moment, and what moved across his face this time was unmistakable. Pride. Not possessive pride, not the pride of someone who had made something happen and wanted credit. Something quieter than that. The pride of a man who looked at another person and saw what they were actually becoming and was glad to be witnessing it. "That's right," Frank said. Caleb looked away before it could get to him too much. But it got to him anyway. He rode back with Ray at 10:30, and the city came back up around them as they came in from the desert, the lights of Phoenix assembling themselves on the horizon and then surrounding them, the familiar geometry of streets and intersections, and the particular density of a city at night. Caleb watched it through the window. "Ray," he said. "Yeah." "The three people at Marcus's garage, the ones who started talking." He paused. "Are they okay? Are they going to be okay?" Ray was quiet for a moment. "The process is going to take some time," he said carefully. "But the people they talk to, they're being taken care of. Nobody's sleeping on a street because of this." Caleb nodded. "You can't carry them," Ray said. "That's not what this is." "I'm not trying to carry them. He stopped. "I just want to know they're okay." "They're okay," Ray said. He said it with the definiteness of someone who was making it true by saying it, which Caleb understood was not a small thing to be able to do. There were people in the world who could make things true by deciding they would be. Frank was one of them. Ray was another. Caleb was not sure yet if he was one, but he was beginning to wonder. Ray dropped him at his building. Caleb got out, got his bags from the back, and stood on the sidewalk. "Monday," Ray said through the window. "Monday," Caleb confirmed. Ray drove away. Caleb stood for a moment in front of his building. The trees along the sidewalk were still in the night heat. The building was quiet. Somewhere above him, on the second floor, there was a door with a key he was holding in his right hand, and behind the door there was a room, small, empty, off-white walls that was his. He went inside. He lay down on the floor of the living room with his jacket under his head, because he had no furniture yet, and tomorrow he would figure out how to fix that, and he stared at the ceiling of his own apartment, in his own building in Phoenix, Arizona, and he breathed. He thought about Frank saying nobody gets left like that. He thought about Danny saying courage works like that sometimes. I thought about Victor and carburetor theory and the way a room full of strangers had made space for him without making a production of it. He thought about Monday, about Joe Tran's shop in the BMW R90S with the sticky petcock and the kind of work that engaged the part of his brain he liked best, the part that looked at a broken thing and found what was actually wrong with it and fixed it correctly and didn't leave the wrench in the wrong cabinet. I thought about Marcus Bell calling the hospital nurse's station and felt something about that he couldn't immediately categorize. Not satisfaction, not anger. Something more like the clean, neutral recognition of a fact Marcus was afraid. Marcus was afraid because the system he'd built required people to have nowhere to go, and Caleb now had somewhere to go, and that changed the entire equation. He had not planned any of this. He had not planned to save Frank Dawson. He had not planned to lose his job. He had not planned to meet Ray or Danny or Joe Tran or Victor with his bridge cable arms and his carburetor enthusiasm. He had made one decision, a 12-minute decision on a concrete floor, and everything that followed had been a consequence of that decision. cascading outward in directions he could not have predicted and still didn't fully see the edges of. He pressed his palm flat against the floor of his apartment, the way he'd pressed it against the wall that morning. Cool, solid, real. He closed his eyes. And somewhere in the quiet of the room, in the space between awake and asleep, something in Caleb Whitmore that had been braced since he was 16, and the world released him into itself without preparation or apology, began slowly and carefully the long process of letting go. Monday arrived the way important days sometimes did, quietly without fanfare. Just the alarm at 5:47 in the ceiling of his own apartment, and the specific quality of silence that came from a place that was his. Caleb was up and dressed by 6:15. He ate standing in his kitchen, a gas station granola bar he'd bought Sunday, the last of his careful rationing, and went through the job in his mind the way he'd done the night before and the night before that. Joe Tran was fair. Joe Tran asked good questions and listened to the answers. Joe Tran had put him in front of a problem and walked away, which was the sign of someone who trusted the process of finding out rather than the performance of already knowing. He could do this. He walked to Pacific Ironworks because the bus route was inconvenient and he wanted the movement anyway. Wanted the 40 minutes of forward motion to settle his body into the day before his mind had to start working on something real. Phoenix in the early morning was the best version of itself. The heat not yet fully committed. The streets carrying the particular hush of a city that hadn't completely woken up. Joe was already there when he arrived. The bay door was open, the lights were on, and Joe was at his bench with a cup of coffee and a parts diagram spread in front of him. He looked up when Caleb came in, looked at the clock on the wall, 6:58, and looked back at his diagram. "Coffee's in the back," he said. That was it. No orientation speech, no paperwork review, no reminder of the trial period terms. Coffee in the back, and a man who was already working and expected you to be working too. Caleb got coffee and found the BMW R90S exactly where he'd left it on Friday on the stand, petcock still sticky carb, still incorrectly rebuilt twice. He set down his cup and started. The first week at Pacific Ironworks was the strangest week of Caleb's working life, and the strangeness had nothing to do with difficulty. The work itself was well within what he could do, harder in some places than Desert Line Garage had allowed him to be, which was a relief rather than a challenge because he'd been holding himself back for 11 months, and the release of that was almost physical. What was strange was everything surrounding the work. Joe talked to him like an equal, not like a favor, not like a project, like a man who had assessed someone's competence and adjusted his communication accordingly, which meant directly, specifically with the assumption that Caleb could handle information delivered without softening. When Caleb made an error on the third day, misread a torque spec on a Harley primary case, because the shop manual he was using had a misprint that nobody had caught, Joe came over, looked at the work, said that spec's wrong in that edition. Here's the correct one, handed him the updated manual, and went back to what he was doing. No lecture, no reminder of the trial period, no implication that the error revealed something about Caleb's character or fitness for the job, just the correct information and the assumption that Caleb would use it. He stood there for a moment after Joe walked away, holding the manual, feeling the absence of what he'd been trained to expect. Then he went back to work. By the end of the first week, he had finished the BMW petcock replaced, carb properly rebuilt for the third time with the correct diagnosis, this time fuel delivery clean and consistent, and Joe had test-ridden it himself and come back in and said simply, "Good." Caleb called Frank that evening. "First week," Frank said when he picked up. "First week," Caleb confirmed. "How is it?" Caleb thought about how to answer that accurately. "It's like I've been breathing through a straw for a year and someone just took it away." A pause, then Frank's voice carrying something warm underneath the flat surface. "That's what real work feels like." Joe doesn't do what Marcus did, Caleb said. The whole thing where you never quite know where you stand, where the rules change based on his mood. Joe just says what he means. Joe's a good man, Frank said. I've known him 15 years. He doesn't waste time on anything that isn't useful. He gave me the BMW job on my own, Caleb said. Just handed it to me. No supervision, no checking in every hour. He trusted you with it. I know, he stopped. Say it. That's not something I was used to. Frank was quiet for a moment, then, you're going to have to get used to it. Being trusted, being given things because you've earned them, not because someone's calculating what it costs them. Another pause. How's the apartment? I got a mattress, Caleb said. From the Goodwill on 7th. It's a twin, but it's real. A real bed, Frank said, and there was something in his voice that made Caleb think the man was smiling. A real bed, Caleb confirmed. They talked for a while longer, Frank asking specific questions about the work, about Joe's shop, about the neighborhood. And Caleb noticed not for the first time that Frank asked questions the way people did when they were actually interested in the answers, rather than just filling the space before they said what they wanted to say. He filed that away the way he filed things that were worth learning. After they hung up, Caleb sat on his mattress in his apartment and did nothing for 20 minutes. Not survival math, not planning, not cataloging what needed to be fixed or managed or anticipated. Just sitting, just existing room that was his at the end of a day of work that was real. He was still learning how to do that. 2 weeks into the job, something happened at Pacific Ironworks that Caleb didn't expect. A man named Glenn came in with a custom build. He was planning a project bike. 68 Triumph Bonneville wanted it restored, but modified street legal, but with some specific performance work done to the engine. Joe talked to him for 20 minutes at the counter, then called Caleb over. Glenn, this is Caleb. He's going to be leading your build. Glenn was 50-something, retired military, bearing the kind of man who shook hands like he meant it. He looked at Caleb, 20 years old, still carrying the lean economy of someone who'd been surviving rather than thriving, and something moved across his face that Caleb recognized as the beginning of doubt. He's pretty young, Glenn said to Joe, not quietly enough. He found a petcock problem on an R90S that 2 other mechanics missed in a week, Joe said without inflection. He's doing your build. Glenn looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at him without flinching, had gotten better at that lately, at not filling the silence with reassurance, and after a moment Glenn nodded. All right, he said, tell me what you need from me. Caleb told him. It was the first time he'd run a client conversation on his own, and he felt the slight elevated quality of his own attention through it. Sharper, more deliberate, making sure he was listening correctly and communicating clearly, and not letting his own competence outrun his ability to explain what he was doing in terms Glenn would find useful. He took detailed notes. He asked specific questions. He told Glenn one thing he might not want to hear, that the timeline Glenn had in mind was optimistic given the condition of the engine cases, and he told it directly the way Joe had modeled. Glenn left looking satisfied. Joe came over after. Good, he said, just that, good. Caleb went back to work. But something had shifted in the room. Subtly, specifically in the way things shifted when you demonstrated something and the room absorbed it and recalibrated. The other mechanic at the shop, a man named Arturo, who was 38 and had been with Joe for 6 years, had been watching the Glenn conversation from his bay. He hadn't said anything during it, but that evening as they were closing up, he stopped next to Caleb at the parts cabinet and said without preamble, that Triumph builds a good one. You need anything. I know the 68 engine cases pretty well. Caleb looked at him. Thanks, he said. I might take you up on that. Arturo nodded once and went back to closing up. It was not a dramatic moment. It was not even a significant one on the surface. But Caleb felt it as exactly what it was, an extension of professional respect from someone who'd been watching and had reached a verdict. He stored it with the rest of the things he was accumulating: Joe's direct communication, Frank's flat honesty, Ray's patient presence, Victor's carburetor enthusiasm. Small pieces of a language he was learning to speak. The language of people who didn't need anything from you in order to be real. 3 weeks after Caleb started at Pacific Ironworks, Danny Reeves called him. He saw the name on his screen and answered on the second ring. You have a few minutes, Danny asked. I'm on lunch. Yeah, there's something you should know. Danny's voice had the quality it had at the gathering, not pretentious, not building, to something just direct in the way of someone who thought you deserved the information in front of the editorial. The labor board investigation at Desert Line Garage. It moved faster than expected. Caleb set down his sandwich. Okay. They went in for an inspection 2 days ago, Danny said. Based on what the workers reported combined with some financial records that turned up, Marcus had been doing this longer than you knew. The housing employment scheme wasn't just the 4 of you. He'd been running versions of it for 7 years. Different workers, different arrangements, but the same basic structure. Keep people where they can't leave, pay them less than they're owed, and pocket the difference. Caleb said nothing. The number they're looking at in terms of back wages and penalties is significant. Danny continued. The garage is going to close. Maybe temporarily, maybe permanently. Marcus is going to have a hard few months. Caleb absorbed this. He thought about the employees he'd known at Desert Line Darren, who was good with suspension work and never said much. Rosa at the front counter, who'd been there for 3 years and always looked like she was calculating whether today was the day she'd say something to Marcus and then deciding it wasn't. He thought about the version of himself 11 months ago, walking into that place, desperate and grateful and willing to absorb whatever terms were offered because the alternative was worse. The other workers, he said, are they going to get what they're owed? The process takes time, Danny said. But yes, that's what the back wages calculation is for. Good, Caleb said, and then with the same flat directness he'd been learning. Is Marcus going to come after me, claim I was involved in reporting him? Danny paused, a short pause, one that communicated that the question was good rather than paranoid. He might try, he said, but you weren't involved in the report. You left before any of this started. Your name comes up in the timeline of events, but only as you were there, you got fired. That firing is what cracked the others loose. You're a witness to the situation, not a participant in the complaint. Another pause. Frank's talked to some people. If Marcus tries anything in your direction, he'll find that there are people paying attention. Caleb sat with that for a moment, the strange warm weight of people paying attention on his behalf, which was so unfamiliar, a sensation that it still required adjustment time. Okay, he said. One more thing, Danny said. Caleb waited. There was a woman at the garage, Sandra Ruiz. She was there 4 years, same arrangement as yours. When the investigation started, she lost her housing too. She's got 2 kids. Danny's voice stayed even, which somehow made it land harder. We've got some people working on the housing situation, but it's going to take a couple weeks to sort. In the meantime, she's at a family shelter on the west side. The silence stretched. Why are you telling me? Caleb said slowly. Because you asked about the workers, Danny said. Because I thought you'd want to know. A pause. And because I've been watching you for a few weeks now, and I think you're the kind of person who does something with information like this rather than just carrying it. Caleb stared at his sandwich. What can I do? He said. Probably nothing right now, Danny said. But knowing is something. And sometimes knowing first means you are ready to help when the moment shows up. They ended the call. Caleb sat in the small back room of Pacific Ironworks with his uneaten sandwich and the information about Sandra Rose and 2 kids at a shelter on the west side, and felt a particular weight of a story that wasn't his connecting to a story that was. He had been Sandra Ruiz. Not exactly the details were different, but the essential architecture was identical. The housing tied to the job, the fear of losing both at once, the careful management of a desperation that someone else was profiting from. He had gotten out because Frank Dawson had a cardiac arrest at exactly the right garage. Sandra Ruiz was still in it. He went back to work. But he carried the information with him through the afternoon, the way you carried something you hadn't decided what to do with. Yet not pressing on it, not ignoring it, just keeping it somewhere accessible. That evening he called Frank. He told him what Danny had said. All of it, the investigation, Marcus, the timeline, Sandra Ruiz. Frank listened without interrupting. When Caleb finished, Frank said, "You're thinking about what you can do." "I don't have much," Caleb said. "I have a paycheck coming in a week. I'm still building." "I know. But the shelter on the west side is Jefferson Street," Caleb said. "I know that shelter. I know how long the wait is for a family bed. I know what the days feel like in there when you've got kids with you." A pause. "What are you thinking?" "I don't know yet," Caleb said honestly. "But Danny said knowing first means you're ready, so I'm getting ready." Frank was quiet for a moment. Then, in the voice that didn't need volume to have weight, "You know what that is? What you just said." "What?" "That's someone who stopped doing survival math," Frank said. "That's someone who started doing something else." Caleb didn't answer immediately because the observation required sitting with it. For 11 months, every calculation he'd made had been structured entirely around his own survival. What he needed, what he was losing, what he had to preserve. The math had been singular and inward and necessary because when you had nothing, the only thing you could afford to protect was yourself. Something had shifted. He wasn't sure exactly when. Maybe on the floor of the garage with his hands on Frank's chest. Maybe in the diner, maybe in the first night on the floor of his own apartment, pressing his palm against the cool concrete. "I'll figure something out," he said. "I know you will," Frank said. "And when you do, you won't have to do it alone." Caleb let that land. "Frank," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Go." "When you woke up in the hospital, the first thing you asked, 'Who saved me?' Why was that the first thing before water, before Carol, before anything?" Frank was quiet for a beat. "Because I knew someone had done something for me," he said. "I could feel it even before I was fully conscious. The body knows, and I needed to know who it was because you don't receive something like that anonymously. It doesn't work that way. Someone put themselves between you and death, and you owe it to them to at least know their name." Caleb processed that. "You didn't owe me anything," he said. "That's not how I see it," Frank said. "You don't owe me anything either for the apartment or the job referral. But we're both doing things for each other because that's how it works when people are real with each other. Obligation isn't the point. The point is you see somebody and you respond to what you see. That's all." It was the simplest thing Frank had said to him and the one that required the most thinking. I was still thinking about it 4 days later when Sandra Ruiz walked into Pacific Ironworks. I didn't know it was her at first. He was in the middle of the Triumph build engine cases off measuring the bore on cylinder 1 when he heard voices at the counter and looked up and saw Joe talking to a woman he didn't recognize. Mid-30s, tired in the specific way of someone who'd been running on reduced sleep for longer than one bad night, wearing clothes that were clean but carried the particular careful quality of someone who was managing appearances on a limited budget. 2 kids stood slightly behind her, a girl of maybe 9 and a boy younger than that, maybe 6. Something in Caleb's chest registered before his brain did. He wiped his hands on a shop rag and walked toward the counter. Joe was explaining something about a vehicle, a 2009 Honda Civic that Sandra had driven in, which was making a noise in the front end that she was afraid meant something expensive. Her voice was steady, but Caleb could hear underneath it the same quality he had heard in his own voice for 11 months, the careful management of fear in public. Joe saw Caleb approach and said, "This is Caleb. He can take a look." Sandra looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them had met before she'd worked the back end of Desert Line's administrative operation, and Caleb had been entirely in the bays. But something passed between them that was faster than information, the particular recognition of 2 people who had navigated the same specific kind of difficulty. "Sandra Ruiz," he said. Her expression changed. "Careful." "Yes." "I'm Caleb Whitmore," he said. "I worked at Desert Line too." The careful expression stayed for another second, then shifted into something more complicated. Recognition, relief, and underneath both of those something guarded that he understood completely because he'd worn it himself. "You're the one who—" "Yeah," he said simply. She looked at him for a moment. Her daughter had moved to stand beside her and was looking at Caleb with the frank assessment of a child who had learned to read adults quickly. Her son had found a small bolt on the floor and was inspecting it. "I heard what happened to you," Sandra said, "when you got fired, and then after what happened after." She stopped. "I heard you were the reason the investigation started." "No," Caleb said. "You were the reason the investigation started. You and the others who talked. I just left." She shook her head slightly. "You leaving is what made us feel like we could." The garage was quiet around them. Joe had stepped back without appearing to step back the way Joe did, things making space without advertising that he was making it. "How are you doing?" Caleb asked. "Honestly." She looked at her kids, then back at him. "We're managing," she said. He heard himself in it immediately. "The shelter on Jefferson." A pause, she nodded. I thought about what Danny had said, knowing first means you're ready when the moment shows up. "Joe," he said without turning around. "Yeah," Joe said it from somewhere behind him. "Is the guest parking in the back available? Her car needs to stay somewhere safe while she's at the shelter. It's a long walk from Jefferson to the bus with 2 kids." A beat. Then Joe, "It's available." Sandra looked at him. "You don't have to." "I know," Caleb said. "I want to." She was quiet. "The front end noise," he said, shifting back to the practical, because he'd learned that sometimes the most useful thing you could give someone was the return to the solvable problem. "Let me look at it. Won't charge you for the diagnosis. If it's something simple, we fix it and it's done. If it's something bigger, at least you know." "I can't afford—" "Let me look first," he said. "Then we'll figure out what you can afford." Sandra looked at him for a long moment. Her daughter was still watching Caleb with those frank eyes. The boy had put the bolt down and was now looking at the motorcycle on the stand with the open fascination of a 6-year-old in the presence of something loud-shaped. Okay, Sandra said. It was a front control arm bushing worn through on the driver's side, which was causing the knocks she'd been hearing, and would eventually cause the tire to wear unevenly, and then unevenly further, and then fail somewhere. She didn't want it to fail with 2 kids in the car. It was a 2-hour job and the parts weren't expensive. Caleb did it that afternoon while Sandra sat in the waiting area with her daughter and her son, who had been given a shop rag and a bolt of his own to inspect by Arturo, who had observed the situation with the same quiet lateral intelligence he applied to engine problems. When Caleb came out and told Sandra the car was done, she looked at him and said, "What do I owe you?" "Nothing," Caleb said. "Caleb, when you get on the other side of this," he said, "buy your kids a good meal and call it even." She stood very still for a moment. Then she put her hand over her mouth and breathed through it, and Caleb looked away to give her a moment with whatever that was, because he knew that sometimes the thing that broke through was the small thing after the large things had been survived, and the small thing deserved privacy. Her daughter came over and stood beside her and put her hand on her mother's arm without saying anything. The gesture of a 9-year-old who had become more competent at comfort than 9-year-olds should need to be. Caleb crouched down to the girl's level. "What's your name?" he said. "Lily," she said. "Your mom's car is fixed," he said. "She's going to be okay." Lily looked at him with those clear, assessing eyes. "Are you sure?" It was a direct question delivered without the social softening that adults apply to difficult questions. He answered it the same way. "I'm sure," he said. I wasn't certain of everything. He wasn't certain about the timeline of the investigation or the housing situation or the 30 variables between where Sandra was now and where she needed to be. But he was certain about the car, and the car was the question she'd asked, and certainty where you had it was more useful than hedging everything to protect yourself from being wrong. Lily nodded, apparently satisfied. Sandra got herself back together. She thanked him not effusively, not performing gratitude, but directly and specifically the way real thanks landed, and took her kids and drove the fixed car out of the back parking lot and into the Phoenix afternoon. Caleb stood in the bay and watched her go. Arturo came up beside him. "Good thing to do," he said. "Yeah," Caleb said. "She going to be okay?" Caleb thought about it. "I'm going to make some calls," he said. Arturo nodded. He looked at the Triumph on the stand. "Engine cases need to go back on," he said. "I know," Caleb said. He went back to work. That evening he called Frank and told him about Sandra. He told him about the car, about Lily with her serious eyes, about the parking spot in the back, about the bus ride from Jefferson Street that was long with 2 kids. Frank listened. When Caleb finished, Frank said, "What do you need?" "The housing," Caleb said. "Danny said it was a couple weeks to sort. Is there a way to make it faster?" A pause. "What exactly are you asking?" "I'm asking if there's a way to move it forward," Caleb said. "Not skip the process, just if there are people who can push in the right places. Is that something that happens?" "Yes," Frank said. "That's something that happens." "Then I'm asking for that," Caleb said. Another pause, longer this time, and what filled it was not reluctance. Caleb knew the difference between someone considering how to say no and someone deciding how to say yes. This was the second one. "I'll talk to Danny tonight," Frank said. "Thank you," Caleb said. "Caleb." "Yeah." "You know what you're doing right now?" He thought about it. "Doing something with the information," he said. A beat, then Frank's voice quiet and specific. "You're not surviving anymore. You understand that you haven't been surviving for weeks. You're building something." Caleb stood in his apartment, real walls, real address, real floor under his feet, and felt that land. "I know," he said. "Good," Frank said, "because it looks right on you." He hung up. Caleb stood in the quiet of his apartment and thought about Sandra Ruiz's daughter with her hand on her mother's arm and the particular competence of a 9-year-old who had learned comfort too early. He thought about the version of himself at 9, not in foster care, yet still in the last stable placement that had felt almost real, and the specific loneliness of being a child who understood that something was wrong but didn't have any of the tools to fix it. He couldn't go back and fix that. But he was here now in a real apartment with a real job and real people who were real with him. And Sandra Ruiz's car was fixed, and her daughter had gotten a straight answer from someone who meant it. And somewhere in the machinery of things, Danny Reeves was going to make a call that would move a housing timeline forward by 2 weeks. 2 weeks for Sandra, 2 weeks for Lily, 2 weeks for the boy who had inspected a bolt with the seriousness of a small engineer. It was not nothing. It was, in fact, exactly the kind of thing that didn't show up in survival math, because survival math had no column for it, no accounting for what it meant to take the shape of someone who had been through the dark and come out the other side, and then turned around and held a light for the person still inside it. Caleb Whitmore had not known 3 weeks ago that he was capable of being that person. He was finding out now, and the finding out was the best thing that had happened to him in 20 years. The call from Danny came on a Wednesday morning 11 days after Caleb had asked Frank to push on the housing timeline. Caleb was in the middle of reinstalling the Triumph's engine cases when his phone buzzed on the workbench. He looked at the screen, wiped his hands, and answered. Sandra Ruiz has an apartment, Danny said, without preamble, without build-up. Just the fact delivered the way Danny delivered everything, like information that deserved to stand on its own without decoration. North side, 2-bedroom, available Friday. First month covered, same arrangement as yours. After that, it's hers. Caleb set down the torque wrench he was holding. 11 days, he said. 11 days, Danny confirmed. How? We know people who know people, Danny said, and there was something in his voice that was dry without being dismissive. And some of those people owed us more than a 2-bedroom apartment's worth of favors. The math worked out. Caleb stood in the middle of Joe's shop and breathed through something that moved up through his chest without asking permission. He didn't try to name it or manage it. He just let it move through. Does she know? He said. Not yet. We thought you might want to tell her. He thought about Sandra in the waiting area with Lily's hand on her arm. He thought about the 9-year-old with the serious eyes asking if he was sure, and him saying yes because the car was fixed and certainty where you had it was worth something. Yeah, he said, I want to tell her. He called her that afternoon from the back parking lot where her car had been sitting safe all week. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice carrying the careful, managed quality. He recognized the voice of someone navigating a day one piece at a time. It's Caleb, he said. I know, she said. Hi. I have something to tell you. Are you somewhere you can sit down? A pause. That's a sentence that usually means something bad. Not this time, he said. You have an apartment. North side, 2 bedrooms, available Friday. First month's handled. It's yours. The silence on the other end was the specific silence of someone whose processing system had encountered something it didn't have an immediate category for. He'd experienced that silence himself from the inside in the motel room, when Ray had called in the diner, when Frank had laid out the apartment and though up in plain terms and waited for him to catch up. Caleb, her voice had changed. It's real, he said, because that was what he'd needed to hear, and he understood it was what she needed too. It's a real apartment, 2 bedrooms, so Lily and your son each have space. It's real and it's yours, and it starts Friday. Another silence. Longer. Then he heard it, the specific sound of someone whose carefully maintained composure had reached its limit. Not in collapse, but in release, the way a pressure valve worked the relief of something held too long, finally being allowed to go. He stayed on the line and didn't say anything because she did not need words right now. She needed the space to feel it without having to manage anyone else's response to her feeling it. After a minute, she said in a voice that was rough and real, "Tell me what I need to do." Friday morning, he said. Ray will pick you up from Jefferson. He knows where it is. Diane manages the building. You'll like her. She says exactly what she means. 5 sentences, no more. Sandra made a sound that was partway between a laugh and something else. How do you know I'll like that? Because you're someone who's been dealing with people who didn't say what they meant for a long time, Caleb said. Diane's different. A pause. You too, Sandra said quietly. You say what you mean. He didn't have an answer for that, so he didn't manufacture one. Friday, he said, you've got this. He hung up and stood in the back parking lot for a moment and thought about the particular arithmetic of things, the way one decision on a concrete floor had connected to Frank Dawson, connecting to Ray and Danny and Joe Tran, and an apartment on the north side and a control arm bushing, and Sandra Ruiz and 2 kids getting their own rooms on a Friday morning in Phoenix, Arizona. He didn't try to map all the connections. He just stood with the fact that they were there. Then he went back inside and finished the Triumph's engine cases. The 90-day trial period at Pacific Ironworks ended on a Thursday. Joe came over to Caleb's bay at 4:15, 15 minutes before closing, the same deliberate timing he used for everything, and said, "Trial period's up." Caleb looked up from the bike he was working on. "I know. You want to keep working here?" "Yes." "Good," Joe said. "So do I." He extended his hand. Caleb shook it. The handshake lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and not a second more, which was exactly how Joe did everything. And Caleb found that he had come to love that quality in the man, the complete absence of performance, the refusal to inflate moments beyond their actual weight while still being entirely present in them. "Pay goes up 10% starting Monday," Joe said, "and I want you to start taking lead on customer consultations. Arturo will cover your bay when you're up front." Caleb looked at him. "You're sure about the consultations?" "I watched you with Glenn, and I watched you with the Ruiz woman," Joe said. "You explain things correctly. You tell people what they don't want to hear when it's necessary. You don't oversell, and you don't undersell." A pause. "That's rarer than the mechanical work. Do the consultations." Caleb nodded. "Okay." Joe went back to his office. Arturo appeared at Caleb's shoulder approximately 4 seconds later. "Told you," he said. "You didn't tell me anything," Caleb said. "I told you 2 weeks ago that Joe was going to put you on consultations. You didn't believe me." "I believed you," Caleb said. "I just didn't want to assume." Arturo gave him the look he developed for moments when Caleb's caution outpaced his evidence. There's a difference between not assuming and not seeing what's right in front of you. Those are the same thing. "They're not," Arturo said. "One's smart, the other one's just," he gestured vaguely, "old habits." Caleb thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. Old habits. The architecture of someone who'd spent years assuming that good things were either temporary or conditional. The reflex that reached for the catch in every offer, the expiration date on every good development. The way comfort had always previously resolved into the next crisis. He was still unlearning it, but he was unlearning it. That evening he called Frank again, because calling Frank had become part of the structure of his weeks in a way that had accumulated quietly without being decided, the way certain things accumulated when they were genuinely useful rather than forced. "Permanent," Frank said when Caleb told him. "Permanent," Caleb confirmed, "and the consultations, starting Monday." Frank was quiet for a moment, and Caleb could feel the quality of it, the particular quality of someone sitting with good news and letting it actually be good. "You know what I keep thinking about," Frank said. "What Marcus Bell looking at you that first day and seeing someone desperate," Frank said, "and thinking desperate was useful, thinking it meant controllable." A pause. "He read you completely wrong." Caleb thought about that. "He wasn't completely wrong," he said honestly. "I was desperate. I was scared. I needed the job." "He was wrong about the important part," Frank said. "He thought the desperation was all of you. He missed the rest." Caleb didn't answer immediately. "Most people miss the rest," Frank said. "When someone has nothing, people see the nothing. They don't see what's holding the person together in spite of it." His voice was even and deliberate. "I saw it in that hospital room when they told me who kept me alive. A 20-year-old kid with nothing, nobody, no reason in the world to stay on that floor. And he stayed." "I keep saying I just did what anyone would do," Caleb said. "And I keep telling you that's wrong," Frank said. "Stop saying it." Caleb almost smiled. "Okay, good, a beat. Saturday, Carol wants to have dinner. You meet Carol Ray and his wife. Small, just people." Caleb paused. "Dinner. Food. Table. People who want to see you." "Yes." "Okay," Caleb said, and hung up and sat in his apartment, furnished now incrementally with a mattress that had been joined by a second-hand couch and a kitchen table with 2 chairs and a lamp that cast warm light across the off-white walls, and thought about Saturday dinner with Frank and Carol and Ray and his wife. He thought about what it meant to be invited into someone's ordinary life. Not the extraordinary version of things. Not the gathering in the desert with 80 motorcycles and the weight of a story being witnessed, but the ordinary one. Food at a table. People who wanted to see him. He had not had that since he was small enough that the memory had the quality of something he wasn't entirely certain was real. Saturday came. Carol Dawson turned out to be a woman of 61 who cooked with the focused intensity of someone for whom feeding people was a primary language of love, and who applied that language without restraint. The food was abundant and specific and deeply good, and she moved between the kitchen and the table with the ease of someone in total command of her environment, pausing occasionally to put her hand on Frank's shoulder as she passed in a gesture so habitual it was probably invisible to her. Ray's wife was named Patricia Pat, she said immediately with the brisk warmth of someone who had long ago decided that life was too short for formality with people she liked. She was a retired school counselor who asked Caleb questions about his work with the genuine engaged interest of someone who found people comprehensively fascinating and who listened to his answers in a way that made him feel, as she'd probably made many teenagers feel, that what he was saying was worth hearing. Caleb sat at Frank Dawson's dinner table and ate Carol's food and talked to these people who had decided, for reasons that were still only partly comprehensible to him, that he was someone worth knowing, and he felt the strangeness of it, and then felt the strangeness diminish as the evening progressed, replaced by something simpler. Comfort, actual, unremarkable, ordinary comfort. He talked about the Triumph build, which was coming together in a way that Glenn had started stopping by twice a week just to watch, which had become its own kind of ongoing conversation between them about what they were building toward. He talked about the consultations, about the particular challenge of reading what a customer actually needed versus what they thought they needed, and finding the language that bridged the two without making them feel managed. He talked about Sandra Rees and Lily and the 6-year-old, whose name he'd finally learned was Marco, who had apparently told his mother upon entering their new apartment that it smelled like new and that new was good. Carol laughed at that, a real laugh, full and uncalculated. Frank watched Caleb across the table with the expression that Caleb had been learning to receive, the one that meant the man was seeing something he considered worth seeing, and somewhere over the second hour of the evening, Caleb stopped consciously noticing the expression and just let it be part of the room. It was near the end of the evening when the dishes had been cleared, and Pat was telling a story about a student from her last year of counseling that had the table quiet with the concentrated attention of people who recognized a true story. It was near the end of that story when Frank caught Caleb's eye across the table, not signaling anything, not building to a moment, just looking at him. The way you looked at something you were glad was in the room. Caleb held it for a second. Then he nodded. Frank nodded back. That was all. But it was the whole conversation contained in 2 small gestures, and Caleb understood every word of it. 3 weeks after the dinner, Marcus Bell's name appeared in the Arizona Republic. Caleb saw it on his phone during lunch. The article was small, a business brief in the local section, the kind of thing most people skim past. But he read it twice. Desert Line Garage was shutting down pending investigation by the State Labor Board. Multiple violations cited. Wage theft findings covering 7 years of operation. 4 current and former employees named as complainants. The article was careful and dry, and said everything it needed to in the tone of someone recording a fact rather than rendering a verdict. Caleb sat with his phone for a moment. He thought about Marcus's hand on his shoulder in the garage. He thought about "take your hand off my shoulder and call the ambulance." He thought about "you're not a doctor, you're a nobody," and the specific confidence with which Marcus had said it, the confidence of a man who had spent years surrounding himself with people he'd made certain couldn't push back. I thought about the petcock on the BMW R98S that 2 mechanics had missed in a week because they were working from someone else's wrong diagnosis instead of starting fresh. Sometimes the problem isn't what everyone's been told it is, Caleb had said to Glenn when they'd first talked about the Triumph build. Sometimes you have to go back to the beginning and find what's actually broken. That was what had happened at Desert Line. Not his doing, not really. His leaving was a crack in the wall, but the wall had been wrong for years. The others had known it. They just needed the crack to let some air in. He set his phone down and went back to work. That afternoon, Glenn came by to check on the Triumph, which was standard. Glenn came by twice a week and had developed the habit of bringing coffee, one for himself and one for Caleb, which he set on the workbench without making a ceremony of it. He stood beside the stand and looked at the bike and asked specific questions and listened to Caleb's specific answers. And at some point in the middle of the conversation, he said, "My brother-in-law has a shop up in Flagstaff. He's been hearing about you." Caleb looked up from the carb he was adjusting. "Hearing about me, how Joe talks to people," Glenn said. "Joe doesn't say much, but what he says gets around." He sipped his coffee. "My brother-in-law asked if I knew you personally. I said I was watching you rebuild my bike." A pause. "He's interested in contracting occasional diagnostic work. Complex stuff he doesn't have the expertise for in-house." remote consultation, or you drive up when it needs eyes. Caleb processed this. I've got a job, he said carefully. I know, Glenn said. This would be in addition, the kind of work you do in your spare time when someone needs it badly enough to pay well for it. He looked at Caleb over his coffee cup. You don't have to decide anything. I'm just telling you what I heard. Caleb nodded slowly. Tell him I'm interested in a conversation, he said. Glenn's expression did the thing it had been doing more often lately, a slight softening around the edges, the look of someone who was watching a prediction confirm. I'll pass it on, he said. After Glenn left, Arturo drifted over. What was that about? Caleb told him. Arturo was quiet for a moment. Then, you know what's happening, right? What? Your reputation's building, Arturo said. The BMW, the Triumph, the consultations word gets around in this community. Bikes aren't a big world. People talk. He looked at the Triumph. You've been here 4 months, and you already have work finding you from outside. Caleb looked at the bike, at the engine that was almost complete, that was going to run the way it was supposed to run when it left here, correctly diagnosed, correctly rebuilt, correctly calibrated. I just do the work, he said. I know, Arturo said. That's why the work finds you. He went back to his bay. Caleb stood with that for a moment, the idea of work finding him, of reputation being a thing that moved through a community and came back towards you. Not because you'd performed for it, but because you'd simply done what you said you'd do correctly and consistently without fanfare. He had not had a reputation before. He had had a situation. The distinction was not small. It was Frank who called him first when the news about Marcus became more than a local brief. A follow-up article, longer and more specific, revealed that the wage theft investigation had expanded. A former employee, the article didn't name her, but Caleb knew without being told that it was Sandra had provided documentation covering 4 years of the housing employment arrangement records she'd kept with the quiet thoroughness of someone who'd understood that evidence might matter someday, even if she hadn't known when. The labor board's findings were significant. The article used a number that made Caleb set his coffee down. Frank called 20 minutes after the article went up. You saw it, Frank said. Yeah. Sandra's records, Frank said. 4 years of documentation. She kept everything. She kept everything, Caleb said, and felt the weight of it, the image of Sandra in that garage doing her job, managing her fear, keeping her records quietly and carefully, because some part of her had known that someday it would matter. She was ready, he said. She just needed a moment when it was safe to use it. You gave her that moment, Frank said. I left a job, Caleb said. She did the work. Caleb, Frank's voice was patient. Stop dividing up the credit like it's a fixed amount. What you did and what she did are both true at the same time. That's how it works. Caleb thought about that. Okay, he said. There's something else, Frank said. His voice had shifted. Not alarm, Frank didn't do alarm. It wasn't in the register of things he expressed, but something specific, something that had the quality of news that required receiving carefully. Marcus filed a complaint, Frank said. Against you. Caleb went still. What kind of complaint? He's claiming you instigated the workers, that you coordinated the report. His attorney filed something with the labor board saying you orchestrated the whole thing from outside after you were fired. The silence stretched. That's not true, Caleb said. I know. I talked to Danny once about Sandra. I asked him to push on the housing timeline. That's it. I know, Frank said. And Danny has documentation of that. And Sandra has her own documentation that makes clear she kept records long before you were involved in anything. A pause. Marcus is trying to muddy the water. His attorney thinks if he can introduce you as a coordinating figure, it complicates the original complaint. Caleb sat down. I thought about Marcus's hand on his shoulder in the garage. He thought about Marcus calling the hospital nurses station. He thought about the particular way Marcus operated, not frontally, not directly, but from the side. Finding angles, creating pressure, using whatever leverage was available. He's still doing it, Caleb thought. Even now, even with the thing falling apart around him, he's still working the same way he always worked. What do I do? He said. Nothing, Frank said. You do nothing. You have Danny, you have the documentation, you have Sandra's 4 years of records that tell a very clear story about a situation that existed long before you ever walked into that garage. A pause. And you have other people paying attention. Marcus filed that complaint this morning. By this afternoon, his attorney had 3 calls from people I know, making clear that what Marcus is attempting is not only factually unsupported, but is going to be scrutinized very carefully. Another pause. He's not going to get traction with this. Caleb breathed slowly. I hate this, he said. I saved his customer's life, and he's still... I know, Frank said. That's who Marcus is. That's the full picture of who he is. The version of Marcus who hired you when you had nothing wasn't generous. He was strategic. And the version who's filing complaints now isn't wounded. He's cornered. He paused. Cornered people do exactly what Marcus is doing. It doesn't mean it works. Caleb was quiet. You're okay, Frank said, quiet and certain. I'm telling you you're okay. Caleb heard it. Let it land. Okay, he said. It took 2 weeks for Marcus's complaint to be formally reviewed and rejected by the labor board. Danny sent Caleb a text with 2 words: dismissed. Done. Caleb read it on his phone in Joe's shop and set the phone face down on the workbench and stood there for a moment with his hands on the cool metal surface and let the thing that had been tense in him since Frank's call release. It didn't release all at once. It went the way tension always went when it had been held a while, gradually and then completely. And at the end of it, he felt something clean and uncomplicated. It was done. Marcus Bell was not a factor in his life anymore. He picked up the phone and texted Danny back, thank you. Then he texted Frank the same 2 words. And then he put the phone in his pocket and went back to the Triumph, which was in its final stages. The build was nearly complete, the engine running correctly for the first time in what Glenn estimated was 6 years, the whole bike coming back to itself the way things did, when someone took the time to find what was actually wrong. Glenn came by that afternoon and stood in front of the Triumph for a long time without saying anything. She's ready, Caleb said. Glenn put his hand on the tank. I can see that. You want to hear her run? More than anything. Caleb started the engine. The sound filled the bay deep and correct and with the particular authority of a machine operating at the level it was designed for rather than struggling below it. Glenn stood there and listened with the expression of a man hearing something he'd been hoping for and not entirely certain he'd get. After a minute, he said quietly, mostly to himself, there she is. Caleb let it run for a while. Then he shut it off. Glenn looked at him. Whatever you need in this life, he said, I want to know about it. You understand what I'm saying. Caleb looked at him. I understand, he said. Good. Glenn extended his hand. Caleb shook it. The gathering Frank had been talking about for 2 months happened on the first Saturday in October when the Phoenix heat had finally released its grip, enough that being outside in the evening was something you did by choice rather than necessity. It was bigger than the first gathering Frank had mentioned it might be, but Caleb hadn't quite translated the abstract number into the reality of what he was walking into when Ray's truck pulled up and he saw how many bikes were there. More than 100. He stopped on the edge of it. Ray came around the front of the truck and stood beside him. You okay? Yeah, Caleb said. Just a lot. They came because they wanted to, Ray said, with the simplicity of a man who knew it was true and didn't think it needed elaboration. Frank found him almost immediately, had clearly been watching for the truck, and walked over with Carol beside him. Frank moved differently than he had 4 months ago. Not dramatically differently, not in a way a stranger would notice, but Caleb noticed. He moved with less caution, like a man who had passed through something and come out the other side with his understanding of his own limits recalibrated. You made it, Frank said. I made it, Caleb said. Carol reached out and put her hand on his face, both hands briefly the way a mother did, and looked at him with the particular expression she'd been directing at him since the dinner. The one that he'd finally accepted was simply love, the uncomplicated kind, the kind that didn't require justification or history, the kind that decided on its terms and then committed to them. You look good, she said. I feel good, he said, and meant it simply. Danny Reeves came over. He shook Caleb's hand and held it for a moment longer than a standard handshake, which for Danny was the equivalent of a speech. The complaint got dismissed, he said. I heard, Caleb said. Thank you. Don't thank me, Danny said. The documentation did the work. Sandra's records did the work. You staying out of it did the work. You made calls, Caleb said. Danny's expression shifted into something dry and warm simultaneously. I make calls, he conceded. It's what I do. What happened next was not a ceremony. It was not a formal acknowledgement. It was not the thing Caleb would have imagined if someone had described it to him in advance. Danny stood in front of the gathered group, over 100 people, their bikes behind them, the desert air cool and carrying the particular quality of an October evening, that felt like a door opening after a long summer, and talked for about 4 minutes. He talked about what had happened in the garage 4 months ago. He described it plainly without embellishment, the way you describe something that was already sufficient and didn't need your help to be significant. He talked about what Caleb had given up. He talked about what had happened after. He talked about Sandra Ruiz and 2 kids in a new apartment, in the labor board complaint, in the documentation, in the Triumph build, in the things that cascaded from one man staying on a concrete floor when everything he had was on the line. I didn't ask Caleb to speak. He just turned and looked at him, and 100 other people turned and looked at him, and Caleb stood there and let himself be looked at and did not look away. And then Danny raised his glass, a paper cup of something non-specific, and said one sentence, "To the kid who stayed." 100 voices said it back. Caleb stood in the middle of it and felt the sound move through him like something physical, like the rumble of 100 motorcycles, like the deep and rhythmic authority of something large and real, and did not try to minimize it or redirect it or file it somewhere. It wouldn't take up space. He let it take up space. He let it be what it was. He found Frank beside him afterward. They stood away from the main group, and Frank had 2 paper cups and handed one to Caleb, and they drank whatever it was, something lemon slightly warm, and stood in the kind of silence that contained more than most conversations. 4 months ago, Frank said finally. 4 months ago, Caleb said, that day in the garage, what you were thinking about when you made the decision not to stop. Caleb thought about it. I wasn't thinking when he said, not consciously. My hands were already moving before I decided anything. What made your hands move? He considered it seriously. I didn't want to be the person who walked past, he said. I'd been walked past enough. I knew what it felt like to be on the ground and have people look away. He paused. I didn't want to do that to someone. Frank was quiet. That's it, Caleb said. That's the whole thing. It wasn't brave. It wasn't noble. I just couldn't do to someone else what had been done to me. Frank turned to look at him. You know what that is, he said. That's the oldest kind of wisdom there is. That's treat people the way you needed to be treated, not the way you were treated, the way you needed to be. He paused. Most people never get there, even people who had everything. Caleb held that. Frank, he said, yeah, I've been thinking about something. He stopped, organized it, started again. Joe offered me the permanent position and the consultations. Glenn's brother-in-law wants to contract diagnostic work. The Triumph's done and it ran right. Sandra's in an apartment. The complaint got dismissed. He paused. Everything I was afraid of losing when I was on that floor, the room, the job, the money, I lost all of it. And then I got something completely different, something I didn't have words for because I didn't know it existed. Frank waited. I keep trying to understand the exchange, Caleb said. What I gave up versus what I got. And I can't make the math work. It doesn't balance in any normal way. Because it's not that kind of math, Frank said. What kind is it? Frank thought for a moment. The kind where you don't know what you're buying when you make the choice, he said. You just make the choice because it's the only choice you can live with. And then the thing you bought, you find out what it is afterward. He paused. You didn't buy a home or an apartment or a family on that floor, Caleb. You found out what you were made of. And what you were made of turned out to be exactly the kind of thing that generates everything else. Caleb stood with that. Around them, the gathering continued conversation and laughter, and the ordinary music of people who trusted each other enough to be themselves in the same space. Victor was explaining something about a carburetor to a younger man who had the look of someone being converted. Arturo had apparently come along with Joe and was engaged in a technical debate with 2 men in cutoff vests that looked like it had been going on for a while and wasn't close to resolved. Pat was talking to Carol with the focused bilateral energy of 2 women who had identified each other as worth knowing and were acting accordingly. Sandra Rose was there. Caleb hadn't known she was coming. He saw her across the gathering, talking to Ray's wife Lily at her side and Marco circling nearby with the kinetic energy of a 6-year-old who had decided that the space was available for investigation. She looked different than she had in Joe's shop, not externally different, not different in the surface things, but differently weighted. Like someone who had set something down that they'd been carrying for a long time and were still adjusting to the changed posture. She caught his eye across the space. He nodded. She nodded back. In it was everything: the shelter on Jefferson Street and the fixed car and the parking spot and the apartment, and the records she'd kept for 4 years, and the complaint that had been dismissed, and the two-bedroom apartment where Marco had said, "It smells like new and new is good." In it was, "I see you, I know where we've both been. We're here now." That was all. That was enough. Frank followed his gaze. "She came with Danny," he said. "She asked if she could." "She should be here," Caleb said. "Yes," Frank said. "She should." They stood a while longer. The evening settled around them, the cool October dark coming in from the desert, the stars beginning their argument above the city lights. People moved and talked and laughed and existed in the particular warmth of a gathering where everyone present had chosen to be there. Caleb Whitmore, 20 years old, formerly of no fixed address, formerly of Desert Line Garage where he had swept floors and absorbed daily reminders of his own dispensability, stood in the middle of all of it and felt for the first time in his life that this was his room. Not because he owned anything in it, not because he'd performed anything to earn his place, but because 100 people had turned to look at him tonight and he had not looked away, and the looking had confirmed something that he'd been slowly, carefully, incompletely learning to believe he was someone. He had always been someone. The world had spent 20 years not showing him that, and then one afternoon on a concrete floor in 12 minutes, with his hands on a dying man's chest and a boss screaming in his ear. He had done the one thing he hadn't been able to stop himself from doing. He had treated a stranger's life as worth more than his own fear, and the world had finally completely, unmistakably shown him back. He was standing in a room full of people who had come because of who he was. Han had an apartment with his name on the lease. He had a job that found him worthy of trust. He had a man who called him on Thursday evenings and asked real questions and listened to real answers. He had a woman and 2 kids whose lives were different because his hands had remembered a lesson he'd learned from a cheerful instructor named Rosa in a shelter community room with a rubber dummy named Carl. He had Lily asking, "Are you sure?" with those clear, serious eyes. Han had Marco saying it smells like new and new is good. He had Frank Dawson who had woken up in a hospital and asked before anything else, before water, before his wife, before the doctors, "Who saved me?" Because that was the kind of man Frank was, and that question had started everything. He thought about the motel room, the $423, the apartment deposit he'd been building toward for 11 months, the survival math he'd been doing every day since he was 16 years old. I wasn't doing that math anymore. He was doing something else now. He was building. Not just his own life, though. That was real, and it was his, and he was building it deliberately and with care and with the steady hands of someone who had learned to find what was actually broken instead of working from someone else's wrong diagnosis. He was building that, but also something wider than that, something that connected outward to Sandra and Lily and Marco, and the workers whose names he didn't know who would receive back wages because someone had finally been in a position to tell the truth, and to Glenn's triumph that ran right for the first time in 6 years, into the conversations he would have at Joe's front counter, where he would tell people what they needed to hear rather than what they wanted to, and to whatever came next that he couldn't see yet. I was building something that started with a choice he hadn't consciously made and ended, if it ended anywhere, in a place he could not yet see the edges of. Frank put a hand on his shoulder, not heavily, just present. "You okay?" he said. Caleb looked at the gathering, at the people, at Sandra and Lily and Marco, at the 100 paper cups raised 4 months ago, and the 100 people who had come back tonight because the story mattered to them. "Yeah," he said, "I'm okay." He meant it without qualification, without the careful management of hope. He'd practiced for years without the partition between what was happening and what he was allowing himself to believe. He meant it the way you meant something when you were finally standing on ground that was real. Caleb Whitmore had walked into a garage with nothing stayed on a concrete floor when everything he had was on the line, and discovered that the only thing more powerful than surviving alone is finally understanding that you never had to.